I am honored to introduce you to our next guest speaker, Neguine Rezaii, the very well-known instructor in neurology from Harvard Medical School, as well as assistant in neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital, which is rated the #1 hospital in the News and World Report Best Hospitals for 2022 and 2023. Neguine's research and clinical areas focus on the following topics: primary progress aphasia, Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, computational neuropsychiatry, and natural language processing. Regarding to her scientific work, namely papers such as work on the use of natural language processing in neuropsychiatry, as well as predicting psychosis and schizophrenia using language patterns, today, she will give us a glimpse about the spoken language production, which involves selecting and assembling words and syntactic. They probe this process by natural language production of individuals with primary progressive aphasia and healthy individuals, suggesting that this syntax-lexicon trade-off might be a general property of the process by which humans turn thoughts into speech. I will now give the floor to our next guest speaker, Neguine Rezaii.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I may need a few seconds because to share my screen because I just do not see the option. It might be some, let's see.
No worries, take your time.
Thank you. I'm uploading it to Google Slides, maybe that helps. Okay, probably that's easier to do. All right. Okay, I see it here now. Excellent. All right, do you see this okay?
Yeah, we can see it, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So, yes, today we are going to talk about an information-theoretic approach to analysis of aphasia. This is based on my work on patients with primary progressive aphasia. I'm going to explain more about it. Earlier this year, we published this work in the PNAS. So the major part of this talk is going to be based on this paper, and then we had 2 follow-up work. They're under review currently. I will give a little presentation of those as well. Okay, the question of how information gets processed in the brain is not quite new. About 1,000 years ago, we had this image. Maybe that was the very first diagram about how the information flows in the brain. It was interesting at that time, maybe started from the time of Galen. The thought was that it is not the brain tissue itself that handles information or does cognitive processes, but the empty spaces known as the ventricles. Maybe they are the regions where the information gets processed. So at that time, the idea was that the information gets transferred from external sensory organs, such as taste, gustus, or olfaction. And then from there, they go to this region that is known as common sense, sensus communis. From there, it goes to the two lateral ventricles that are called imaginativa and fantasia. They form an image based on the information that gets in to the brain from sensory organs. And from there, it goes to the other ventricle for more calculation. And from there to memorativa, which is for language processing. So this was the idea of how information gets processed. Let's travel 1,000 years in time and see what we think about flow of information in language today. As we talk, we turn complex thoughts into a linear sequence of words. in order to do that, we need both noun words and also some syntactic structures to connect these words together. The nature of the relationship between the selection of words and the selection of syntactic rules has been a long-standing debate, and it's going to be the focus of this talk. A lot of what we know about aphasia is from post-stroke aphasia patients. As you all know, we have two broad categories. Again, this is very broad. One category of patients have deficit over here, known as the Wernicke's aphasia, and these individuals have difficulty processing words. There is another group of aphasia, the Broca's aphasia, who have deficit here in the frontal lobe, and these individuals have difficulty producing syntax. As I said earlier, the patient population that I'm working with is primary progressive aphasia. It's a kind of neurodegenerative disorder similar to, for example, Alzheimer's disease, but instead of memory region, it affects the language network. So primarily, this disorder only affects the language network, but over time, it spreads to other regions. So it's a perfect disease model to study language because it is just like a knockout system. Certain parts of language network do not work, and you can just probe the impact of it. It has 3 subtypes. We're going to use these terms a lot, so just make sure that these words become familiar. One of them is called logopenic or LVPPA, and then the other one is semantic or SVPPA. These 2 categories are just like this one. They have difficulty producing difficult words. And then there is another category, the NFB-PPA patients or the non-fluent patients. These individuals have difficulty producing difficult syntax. So when we see this aphasia, we think that, okay, some patients have difficulty producing syntax and some patients have difficulty producing words. So maybe it's just a modular system, and syntax and words are at 2 different locations. And as we talk, these 2 processes, lexical and syntactic, happen independent of each other. But there has been some very faint hint at maybe there is some connection between the 2. Patients who have difficulty producing complex syntax, it has been shown in stroke aphasia patients, they actually use heavier verbs. What are they? We can divide verbs into 2 categories, light and heavy. Heavy verbs would be like fly or donate, as opposed to light verbs such as go, do, be, take. Not much meaning in it. They're lighter in meaning, so we have this division. But it was shown that patients who have difficulty processing syntax, they use heavier words. On the other hand, it was shown that patients with SVPPA, those who have difficulty processing words, they actually use more complicated syntax, probably to compensate. So here we see that, okay, maybe there is some suggestion of trade-off in the literature, but this question has not been explored rigorously because we did not, up until this study, we did not have a measure or a metric that could be applicable to both. Both measure lexical complexity and syntactic complexity in a way that is very similar. For words, it was easy. For words, we had word frequency. I'm going to talk more about it, what word frequency is. But for syntax complexity, we did not have a similar measure. Let's talk about word frequency. What do we mean by that? This is based on the text from the past 25 years of the New York Times. So it's a huge corpus. It has about 858 million words in it. And if you take a look, you see that the word the is the most common one. That is not a surprise. And when you count it, I don't know, it is like 53, I guess, million times it was repeated. But since working with raw numbers is not difficult, we just use the log frequency of it. So we just get the logarithm of this number and we use this column, basically. So to just give you a little bit more idea about that, what are most common, most frequent nouns in English? Year, person, day, house. These are the most common words in English. What is like a very low frequency word? Word like vinculin, I didn't even know what it was until I looked it up. It's actually a cytoskeletal cell membrane protein. So that has a very low frequency of occurrence. And for example, if you want to fill out this blank, we would say the little girl is making a. If you say thing, she's making a thing, you're not giving much information. The word frequency of this word is 5.7. Versus if you say the little girl is making a sandcastle, it has a much lower frequency, 1.9. So just wanted to give you a sense when we talk about word frequency, what we mean by it. And it is more difficult to access words with lower frequency, like sandcastle versus think. All right. So the goals of this study was first to develop a metric that was comparable to word frequency for syntax. And then compare the syntactic and lexical complexity in the sentences of patients with PPA, as they describe a picnic picture. I'm going to show you that picture. And then the main hypothesis was that patients with SVPPA and LVPPA who have difficulty producing complex words would use complex syntax instead. For example, if they have difficulty saying the word a sailboat, low frequency words, they cannot use it, they may come up with another way of saying it, a boat that is moved by the wind. If you take a look, it is actually more complicated in terms of syntax. You see one clause is embedded in another, and then you see a passive tone is moved by, which is more complex. So this is a very complex sentence syntactically. And then we want to show that patients with an NFVPPA, non-fluent aphasia, have difficulty producing complex syntax. They actually may use low frequency words. And then this would suggest a trade-off. And then we want to know whether it is only, if it exists, if it is just for patients with PPA or general population has the same property. All right. So the first goal was to have a metric for measuring syntactic complexity that is comparable to word frequency. This was the picture that was used, as you see the little girl making a sandcastle, older couple picnicking here, you see the sailboat. So most of the examples here are based on this picnic picture. And here's how we got the syntax frequency. This is a sentence from one of the patients. The older couple is picnicking with wine. There are some automatic parsers out there that can give you this, just give you the syntactic structure of it. This is all done automatically. They're available for free. You can use different types of them. This is a dependency parser. It first determines the main heads, the main components of a sentence. Here we've got 3. So the older couple is one component, and then couple is picnicking with wine is another one, and then with wine is another. So here we've got 3 rules. The older couple, the is a determiner. Here we have that. Older is an adjective, we have that, and couple is a noun, we have that. So this is one syntactic rule. The other one, couple is picnicking with wine. Couple is a subject, we have it here. Is an auxiliary. Picnicking is verb, and then we've got the noun here. So this is another rule. So we use this algorithm, we created this part of the algorithm to give us the rules from the parser, and we applied it to all the language of patients with aphasia, with PPA. And we also needed, and this is what we got, for example, determiner plus noun, like the girl, the boy, a sandcastle. This is the most common syntactic rule in English. And everything else comes after. For example, we've got subject plus verb. But we just needed a big corpus in order to make the comparison based on that. So we used, instead of New York Times, which is very common, instead we used switchboard. Why? Because this is spoken language. Patients were just describing it in speaking, but New York Times is like written, very formal. Maybe this is not the best representation of how people talk. So we use switchboard because it is a transcription of the casual conversation of people over phone. So we use that one instead. And we measured, we parsed it, we got all the rules, all the syntactic rules, as I just explained, from this corpus, and we got the word frequency based on that. And then we analyzed the data from our patients. We got NFV-PPA patients 29, and we got LV-PPA, SV-PPA, and we got 53 healthy controls. The first thing we measured was word frequency. Okay, so this is the control. The colors are consistent across this talk. So the control is in blue. And as expected, and this was not a surprise, patients with LV and SV-PPA had difficulty accessing low-frequency words such as sandcastle. So on average, they had a much higher word frequency when compared to healthy control. But interestingly, patients with NFV-PPA, they produced much lower, this is significant, they produce lower frequency words. This is the same information almost. This is blue, normal control, word frequency, this is the distribution of that. As you see the red one, there's a little shift to the left, meaning that they use more low frequency words. And for the other two groups, there's a shift to the right, meaning that they use high frequency words. The interesting part was that we saw the exact opposite pattern in syntax frequency. Patients with NFV-PPA, they have difficulty accessing low frequency syntax. So their average syntax frequency is much higher than healthy controls. And this part is new and interesting, and this is significant. The difference, LV and SV-PPA patients who have difficulty with words, they actually are able to use more complex syntax. Again, some information here. You see there is a shift to the right in terms of syntax frequency for NFV-PPA patients, and a shift to the left for LV and SV-PPA patients. So already, because this is like it seems like a flip image of the word frequency, you already expect a trade-off going on here. In order to directly check the trade-off, we made this graph. What's going on here? So we used a mixed effect model in order to come up with this statistical analysis. This is the combination of all the data that we have from the first part of the study. On the x-axis, we have syntax frequency. We use the logarithm as we talked earlier. And then we have word frequency on the y-axis, again, the logarithm, because it's easier to work with logs. And then we saw this significant negative trade-off, meaning that sentences, and each dot is a sentence. This basically means that a sentence that has very high frequency syntax has low frequency words, and a sentence like here that has very low frequency syntax has high frequency words. I will talk about what it means, but before that, the main question was, is it something that we only see in patients? What happens in healthy controls? Or is it maybe a normal feature in all of us as we talk? And patients with PPA are just using that strategy. So we got data from 99 healthy individuals. This is separate from 53 healthy controls for the first part of the study. New cohort of 99 healthy individuals. We asked them to describe the same picture. We analyzed each sentence, and we saw the exact same pattern, the exact same negative correlation that was significant. Again, each dot is a sentence, and we saw the same trend. So basically, this purple graph suggests that this trade-off, the syntax-lexicon trade-off, is a normal behavior in healthy individuals, and patients with NFV-PPA or LV and SV-PPA, they use the same strategy. They take that strategy to their advantage in order to communicate. There is some theory behind that, or some, maybe I should say, some ideas behind it. There are two different ways that we can explain what's going on. We don't know which one exactly is correct. They're not mutually exclusive, so both can apply. These are famous theories in psycholinguistics. One of them is UID, Uniform Information Density. According to this one, okay, when you want to say something, there are different ways for you to say the same message, to communicate the same message. You can use different words, different syntax, but you usually tend to say a sentence that has the information uniformly distributed. You want to avoid any peaks in information, any peaks or troughs. For instance, if you use a low frequency words, it has a lot of information in it. Then if you use a low frequency syntax, it will be too much information, so you will have a peak. So you want to avoid that. Or if you use a very simple structure, high frequency, if you use, again, high frequency words, then you will have a trough of information. You want to avoid that as well. So you just want a good balance between the two to have a uniform transfer of information. Another account that is also very relevant and can explain the findings is the availability accounts. It's a very simple idea. Words and syntactic structure that are more available are easier to access. What do I mean by more available? For each of us, certain words and certain syntax is easier or more available. For instance, if you're an artist, you can use the word turquoise to talk about the blue, the shade of blue, a particular shade of blue. For me, it might not be as easy to use that word, but since you're an artist, you might have 20 words for the color blue. So lifetime exposure makes certain words more available for you. Or maybe you just watched a movie about a volcano and these words become familiar to you because of the recency effect. You just heard them, so they become more available for you. So there are different reasons that make certain words more available. This is dynamic. It might be different from person to person, from time to time. A year from that volcano documentary, those words may not be available for you anymore. So if some words are more available for you, you will need less cognitive control to access them. So based on the availability account, if you use a word that has low availability, you rarely ever use them, you need a lot of cognitive resource to use that word. And then you will not have enough cognitive resource available in order to use low frequency syntax. So you just cannot. Your brain has reached the maximum capacity, so you just use simple syntax. And similarly, if you use a very simple word, then you will have a lot of cognitive resource to retrieve a difficult syntax. So we don't know, again, which of the two applies, maybe both of them, but these are potential explanations for what's going on, for the effect that we just described. So this is the first part of the talk that I just presented, that paper. But as I said, there are two follow-up studies that builds on this finding. We can interpret what we just talked about in terms of information theory. You're familiar with this person, Claude Shannon. He was one of the main people who revolutionized this field, information theory. He's got a very famous article, mathematical analysis of communication, mathematical theory of communication in 1948. Based on this theory, events, it can be anything, we will talk about some examples, events that have low probability, low frequency of occurrence have more information in them. For example, in a city like San Antonio, the Eureka, it rains a lot. One of the rainiest cities in the world. If you say that next week is going to be a rainy week, you're not giving much information. Why? Because the probability of occurrence is so high that you're not really giving much information. But if you say next week in the city, next week is going to be totally a sunny week, then you're giving a lot of information, because the probability of having a sunny week is so low that then you're providing information. Same applies to words. Words like a word like thing or something is so frequent that doesn't have much information in it. If I say I read a thing, it's a very high frequency word. I'm not giving you much information, but if I say I read a book, a little bit more information. And if I give you the exact book, the Plato's book, then I'm giving a lot more information. All right, so here then, in terms of the other interpretation of this graph that we just talked about, instead of frequency, we can use information. It's just the flip side of that. And then based on that, we can reinterpret what we just talked about. We said if we want to say a message, there are different ways of saying it. So this sentence represents one example. And as we talked about, there are different ways of combining syntactic information and lexical information. In this example, we have almost equal proportion of syntactic information and lexical information. But you can use, as a healthy speaker, you can use a sentence that has more syntactic information in it and less lexical information. So it's just a dynamic range. Depending on how you want to say something, you can use this balance. But again, you see we have this trade-off that we just talked about. How is it relevant to our talk here? Here I'm going to say, well, this finding can help us think differently about the mechanism behind a specific type of aphasia, the non-fluent variant or the Broca's aphasia. When you ask these individuals to describe the picnic picture, these are the common sentences that they have. Boy flying kite, boy flying, boy kite. What's going on here? Several things. So the colors are consistent again. So the blue is control and the red is patients with non-fluent variant of BPA. One obvious thing is that they drop function words. Function words are like determiners, the, prepositions, from, to. So they don't say the boy is flying a kite. They just drop it. So they use more content word rather than function words. So as you see, the ratio is higher. And then they use more nouns when you compare it with healthy controls. For example, they say boy kite. There's no verb in it. It's a sentence. Or they use more heavy verbs. We talked about it earlier than light verbs. They do not use verbs like go or give. They say donate. And then they use more gerunds. This is peripherally relevant. They use INGs a lot. Kiting, going, instead of saying like go, went. A lot of ING. So we now know that healthy controls have the same mechanism, that trade-off that we just talked about. So in the next step of the analysis, we asked healthy individuals to describe the same picnic picture, but we asked them to only produce 1 to 2 word sentences, only that. So it's a very heavy constraint, a big bottleneck in language production. What happened? Exact same pattern, even more accentuated, meaning that almost all words were content words in that situation. Healthy controls producing only 1 to 2 word sentences. Almost all of it were nouns, almost all verbs were heavy, and they used gerunds or ing form a lot. So this tells you that, okay, so maybe this style of language production in non-fluent patients is not because they have difficulty processing syntax. They choose these words because they're more informative. And that's why they're dropping it. They behave similarly as to healthy controls when they have a big constraint. So maybe it's just an adaptive response to a constraint. And as we just talked about earlier, this part, NFE-PPA patients use words that have lower frequency. And when we ask healthy controls to produce very short sentences, you see the frequency drops so dramatically. So the words that they drop is like there's not much information in it. The, very high frequency word, not much information in it. Similarly, they drop like verbs. So when you have a constraint, when you text, when you tweet, there's a constraint, you drop all the non-informative ones and keep the most informative ones. So maybe it's not that they have difficulty using function words. They just don't want to use it because there's no information in it. So current view so far, the popular view to what's going on in NFE-PPA or Broca's aphasia is that these patients have difficulty processing syntax, and that's why they drop certain words. The alternative view that we're proposing is that, no, they drop these words because they do not have much information. So basically, this is the trade-off that we talked about. If there is a pathology in NFE-PPA, it is pushed to the left. So the whole range is normal range for healthy individuals, but for the non-fluent patients, because of the pathology, they're pushed to the left because they cannot use syntactic information. As a result, as an adaptive response, they only use words that have much more lexical information in them. Can we test this hypothesis? We want to say that they want to keep the information the same. So one way to test this hypothesis is to have a metric that can measure the overall information of a sentence, this one. If we can see that this overall amount of information that has both syntactic information in it and lexical information in it, and see that it is the same between healthy controls and patients with NFE-PPA, then we can have evidence for this proposal. So we wanted to look for a measure or a metric that can measure the informational content of a sentence. And this metric should factor in both lexical and syntactic information. Okay, we have this. This is not new. We have this measure called surprisal, and I explained what it is. There are some computational methods. James Mikhailov helped us develop this program. The idea is not new, but the way to measure it using recent advances in natural language processing was new. So, okay, what is surprisal? Surprisal basically is a very simple idea. Basically measures the probability of occurrence of a word here. Okay, the girl is making a. There are certain words, if you think about every single word in English, not all of them can appear here. For example, you cannot say a girl is making an ocean. Why not? Because first of all, it should not start with a vowel because you need, I don't know, so you cannot use a vowel after a. So syntactically it doesn't make sense. Or making an ocean doesn't make sense either. So not every word is probable. Making a sandcastle is reasonable, both syntactically makes sense and both meaning-wise, lexically, it makes sense. So, so we just measured this one and then apply it to every single word that appears in this sentence. What is the difference between word frequency? You might say, oh, this is very similar to word frequency. It is not quite word frequency because word frequency is not sensitive to the context or syntactic structures, but surprisal is sensitive to the syntactic structure of a sentence. And then we use the language model. These are computational systems that can help us do the measurement. So first we wanted to, even though theoretically we knew that surprisal takes into account both lexical information and syntactic information, we just wanted to make sure that it is the case. Very simply in mathematics, using general additive models, you can just check this. Surprisal is made up of word frequency and syntactic frequency. We used that method and we saw actually, yeah, so this is surprisal and it has a negative relationship between word frequency, which makes sense. Words that have lower frequency have more information. Same thing with syntactic frequency, even though the relationship between syntactic frequency is a little bit nonlinear when you compare it to this one, but that's okay. It's still a negative relationship, meaning that syntax that is low in frequency has more information in it. And then lastly, we compared the surprisal of patients with NFE-PPA and that of healthy controls, and we found that they produce exactly the same amount of information, total information. So the summary is that even though patients with NFV-PPA have difficulty producing complicated syntactic structure, they catch up by using more informative words, and they keep the informational content the same. So the alternative view, as we said, is that patients with NFV-PPA increase or catch up with the information by choosing more informative words. The conclusions of this talk: language production involves maintaining a balance between the complexity of words and the complexity of syntax. This property of normal language production can help patients with aphasia to find alternative ways of communicating their message. The syntax-lexicon trade-off, whether you see it in terms of information or whether you see it in terms of frequency, is a dynamic balance. We saw the sliding bar. But in certain conditions, maybe you have some constraint. Maybe there is word count limitation, or maybe there is some disease such as NFV-PPA. You might be pushed to either side of this and not have the full range at your disposal. Lastly, automated methods like in natural language processing, like measuring surprisal, now allow us to test new hypotheses that sometimes can lead to a paradigm shift in how we see how a disease emerge mechanistically and how we interpret the symptoms of a disease. That's it for my talk today.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure we captured our participants' attention. Now let's turn to the questions. The first question asked by one of our participants is how a person with aphasia caused by traumatic brain injury recovers from a neurological perspective, if it can recover.
Yes, it very much depends. So that's a good question, because the strategy that we just talked about is not a normal recovery that we usually have. When we have stroke, when we have trauma to the brain, gradually over time, you see, like, it is not just language. When a patient has stroke and cannot walk initially, over time, they start to walk again because there is neural plasticity. We will have new connections, cell-to-cell connections, and there are different pathways formed, and the patients can gradually walk, maybe not as well as before, but still can do that. So plasticity is one way to compensate for the deficit. So it is possible to happen in language. They do a lot of speech therapy, patients with trauma, again, depending on the location in the entire language network where it is. And so plasticity can happen. What we talked about today, the method of compensation, does not require plasticity. It does not require time. It can happen right away. Why? Because it's a normal mechanism that already exists in us. We just take advantage of that.
Thank you. And the other question, are new cortex areas in charge with learning, speaking, and syntax?
Can the person clarify more? What does that mean? After trauma, they mean, or
I think that, yeah, after trauma, yeah. Are you in charge?
After trauma, yes, there might be regions that are not necessarily specialized for that. They might use neighboring regions to help with so it is not necessarily, because according to older literature, the brain cells do not get in terms of number, they're the same. So new connections happen, although more recent literature has shown that maybe there are some regions of the brain that can produce new cells. But for the most part, the plasticity does not happen through increasing the number of cells. It's just new connections, establishing new networks.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions?
I would like to ask something. How do you think the results of the performance of aphasic patients change with the complexity of a language in other languages?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We don't know. This was only tested in English. I am very curious about other languages. We have just started collecting data in Spanish and Persian. Persian is relatively remote from the English structure, so we're curious. It seems to be a very basic property of cognition because, you have got very limited cognitive resources. If you use a lot of it on syntax, you do not have much left for complex words. So it's such a basic property about efficiency, about economy of cognitive processes that I expect it's going to be in other languages, but we won't know until we test other languages.
I see. I also want to ask one more question, if it's possible.
Absolutely.
How will the bilingualism affect their performance?
Yeah, so all these individuals were native English speakers. I'm just thinking right now about the possibility. That's another very good question, because it's possible that a proportion of them, even though they're native English speakers, they might be bilingual. Can they use words from another language? And actually, it is the case that patients who are bilingual, let's say somebody is native in Spanish, comes to the US, they resort to their original language in severe aphasia. So they go back to speaking Spanish. And we do see when patients have difficulty in aphasia, when they have difficulty with English, they use a native language. It's also possible, it seems to be plausible that they do the same trade-off happens. Interesting question, needs to be done. I'm not getting good ideas from you all to test and follow up on this study.